14 French pilots shot down 273 German aircraft on the Eastern Front of World War II. That number shouldn't exist, and according to every rule of air combat, it never should have happened. They weren't flying better planes, they weren't more numerous, and they weren't supposed to be there at all. While most of Free France fought alongside the British, these pilots chose the most lethal sky of the war, facing the Luftwaffe at its peak. Survival there was measured in missions, not months. Yet German reports began to repeat a strange conclusion. Something about these pilots didn't make sense. They attacked without warning, broke formations on purpose, ignored doctrines every ace trusted, and turned discipline into a weakness. The Germans called them French sorcerers. The Soviets treated them like anomalies. History quietly moved on. Between 1943 and 1945, these French pilots destroyed 273 German aircraft. Here is how they did it, and why this story was buried for 70 years. If this story sounds impossible, stay with us, because the number 273 isn't the mystery. How it happened is, the number is 273. At first glance, it looks like a statistic pulled from propaganda or post-war exaggeration. In the air war over the Eastern Front, numbers like that were supposed to belong to massive formations, entire air armies, not to a small group of foreign pilots operating far from their homeland. Yet the figure appears again and again in operational records, confirmed victories, and post-war archives. 273 German aircraft destroyed by French pilots between 1943 and 1945. Not probable, not claimed, but confirmed. The problem is not whether the number is real. The problem is that it should not be possible. To understand why, you first need to understand what the Eastern Front actually was. This was not the air war over Britain or Western Europe, where pilots flew structured patrols, rotated regularly, and fought within relatively stable systems. The Eastern Front was aviation attrition at its most brutal. Aircraft were lost daily. Pilots disappeared constantly. Survival was not measured in years or even months, but in missions. By 1943, German fighter units operating in the East were not inexperienced formations. They were filled with veterans who had survived Poland, France, Britain, Stalingrad, and the Caucasus. They flew disciplined formations, perfected attack patterns, and relied on doctrines refined through thousands of engagements. These were pilots who understood altitude, energy advantage, and coordinated maneuvers better than almost anyone else in the world. Against them, the average life expectancy of a new pilot was short. In some sectors, Soviet records suggest that a fighter pilot could expect to survive only a handful of combat sorties before being killed or wounded. Even experienced pilots were worn down by exhaustion, cold, mechanical failures, and constant combat pressure. This is where the number 273 begins to feel wrong, because the French pilots who achieved it were not flying superior machines. Their aircraft were not technological miracles. Early on, many flew fragile fighters with limited protection, unreliable radios, and little margin for error. They did not enjoy overwhelming numerical superiority. In many engagements, they were outnumbered. And most critically, they were foreigners operating inside a system that was not their own. Conventional wisdom says that under these conditions, success should be limited. Survival alone would be considered an achievement. Accumulating hundreds of confirmed victories should be impossible. Yet German after-action reports began to note a recurring anomaly. Encounters with these French pilots did not follow expected patterns. Attacks came from directions that made no sense. Formations dissolved instead of tightening. Engagements became chaotic in ways German training had not prepared pilots for. Victory ratios shifted, not dramatically overnight, but consistently, and always in the same sectors. This is where the real contradiction emerges. Every major air force of the Second World War relied on doctrine. British pilots emphasized altitude and disengagement. American pilots focused on formation, strength, and overwhelming firepower. German pilots depended on discipline, coordination, and tactical hierarchy. Doctrine was not optional. It was survival. But doctrine only works when both sides agree to play by the same rules. The French pilots who arrived on the Eastern Front in 1943 did not because they were reckless or ignorant, but because their experience had already taught them a different lesson. Many had lived through collapse, defeat, and the sudden realization that established systems could fail catastrophically. They did not trust doctrine the way others did, and more importantly, they were not emotionally invested in preserving it. They had nothing left to protect except the mission in front of them. This created a psychological asymmetry that standard military analysis often overlooks. German pilots expected opponents to behave within a predictable tactical framework. When that expectation failed, hesitation followed. And, in air combat, hesitation is lethal. The French pilots did not win by being braver in the romantic sense. They won by removing predictability from the fight. They did not seek perfect positioning. They sought disruption. They did not try to outfly the enemy. They tried to unbalance him. This is why the number 273 matters. It is not impressive because it is large. It is disturbing because it represents a systemic failure of expectations. It suggests that under the right conditions, a small unit can outperform far larger forces by attacking not strength, but certainty. And this raises a deeper question. If this happened, if these results were achieved repeatedly and documented, why is this story so rarely told? Why does it sit at the margins of popular history, mentioned briefly, if at all? Why do most people associate air superiority in World War II almost exclusively with Anglo-American or German narratives? The answer is not found in the sky. It is found in what came after the war. Because the moment victory was secured, a different kind of battle began. One over memory, narrative, and political convenience. And the story of French pilots destroying German aircraft on the Eastern Front did not fit comfortably into the world that followed. Before understanding how they fought, we need to understand what they walked away from, what they were offered instead, and why their choice placed them on a path unlike any other Allied unit in the war. That choice is where the story truly begins. To understand why these French pilots ended up rewriting the rules of air combat, you first have to understand the choice they made before they ever faced a German aircraft. After 1940, the path for French aviators who refused defeat seemed obvious. Those who escaped occupied France usually headed west, toward Britain. The Royal Air Force offered structure, protection, and a clear place within an established command. It was the safest option available in a war where safety was rare. But safety came with conditions. French pilots, flying with the British, were expected to integrate fully. British command, British doctrine, British squadrons. French identity existed only as a symbol on a uniform sleeve, not as an operational reality. For many, this was acceptable. For others, it felt like another form of disappearance. What most histories gloss over is that refusal did not always mean collaboration or cowardice. In some cases, refusal meant looking for a fight that did not yet exist. When an alternative appeared, it did not come from London. It came from Moscow. The Soviet offer was simple and brutal. A fully autonomous French fighter unit, French insignia, French leadership, French pilots flying under their own name. In return, they would fight on the Eastern Front, the most lethal airspace of the war. No illusions were offered, no promises of survival, just clarity. For most military planners, the decision would have been irrational. The Eastern Front consumed aircraft and pilots at a rate unmatched anywhere else. Cold alone destroyed machines. Exhaustion killed men as effectively as bullets. Tactical mistakes were rarely forgiven twice. Yet for the pilots who accepted the offer, rational calculation was not the point. By choosing the Eastern Front, they were not selecting the path of maximum effectiveness. They were choosing the path of maximum consequence, a place where excuses disappeared, where defeat could not be blamed on lack of opportunity, where every mission carried weight. This choice immediately placed them outside every familiar framework. They were French, but not fighting for France in the conventional sense. They were allied, but not under British or American command. They were integrated into Soviet operations, but never fully absorbed. They existed in between systems, and that mattered more than anyone realized at the time. When they arrived, nothing was tailored for them. Equipment was Soviet. Procedures were Soviet. Infrastructure was Soviet. The environment was hostile in ways Western pilots had never experienced. Extreme, cold, stripped metal of its tolerance. Engines failed without warning. Radios worked when they felt like it. There was no gradual adaptation period, no controlled learning curve. These pilots were expected to perform immediately or be replaced. But something unexpected happened. Because they were outsiders, they were not bound by inherited assumptions. They had no loyalty to existing doctrines beyond what worked. Soviet instructors initially viewed them with skepticism. German pilots soon learned to fear them. But internally, the unit developed without reverence for rules that no longer made sense. Where other pilots were trained to preserve formation above all else, these men learned to prioritize survival in fluid chaos. Where others depended on strict radio coordination, they learned to read motion, intention, and timing visually. Where doctrine emphasized disengagement, they learned when commitment was the safer option. This was not innovation born from theory. It was adaptation born from exposure. On the Eastern Front, hesitation killed faster than aggression. Predictability invited interception. Discipline, when rigid, became a liability. And these lessons were absorbed not intellectually, but physically, through repetition under pressure. The result was a unit that did not behave like a unit at all. To German pilots, this was deeply unsettling. Luftwaffe doctrine depended on hierarchy. Leaders initiated, wingmen supported. Movements were calculated, rehearsed, and repeated across units. Against such a system, predictability was strength. The French pilots disrupted that logic by refusing to present a stable pattern. Engagements fractured, formations dissolved. Attacks came early, late, or not at all. The fight never settled into a recognizable rhythm. This was not recklessness. It was selective disorder, and it produced an asymmetry that conventional analysis failed to account for. German pilots could anticipate what an opponent should do. They could not anticipate what these pilots would do, and that gap between expectation and reality created hesitation, sometimes only seconds long, often just long enough. The choice to fight on the Eastern Front did more than place these French pilots in danger. It stripped away every external structure that normally defines military behavior. What remained was instinct, refined through constant exposure to failure and survival. This is where the paradox deepens. The environment that should have destroyed them instead forced them to evolve faster than their opponents. The absence of safety margins accelerated learning. The lack of institutional protection sharpened decision-making, and the impossibility of retreat eliminated the option of half measures. By the time German units began documenting unusual encounters, the transformation was already complete. These French pilots were no longer adapting to the Eastern Front. They were shaping it. But this raises another question. If this approach was so effective, why did it not spread widely? Why did other units not adopt similar methods? Why did doctrine remain largely unchanged even as evidence accumulated? The answer lies in what militaries value most: order, predictability, control. What these pilots demonstrated was not easily teachable. It could not be standardized, drilled, or safely replicated. It relied on trust, developed through shared exposure, not instruction. It required pilots willing to accept ambiguity and risk without constant validation from command. Most institutions cannot tolerate that for long, which is why this story does not lead to a revolution in doctrine. It leads to something far more uncomfortable, a recognition that under extreme conditions, effectiveness may come not from tighter control, but from letting go of it. To understand how this worked in practice, we need to look at the mechanics of their combat behavior itself. Not individual heroics, not dramatic encounters, but the underlying system they created in the air. That system is where the real secret of 273 lies. The success of these French pilots did not come from a single trick, a special maneuver, or a secret piece of equipment. It came from a system that emerged under pressure, one that did not exist on paper and could not be taught in classrooms. German pilots struggled to describe it because it violated the logic they were trained to trust. What they were facing was not randomness. It was controlled chaos. To understand this, you need to understand what air combat doctrine is designed to do. Doctrine exists to reduce uncertainty. It provides clear rules for positioning, engagement, and disengagement. It tells pilots where safety lies and when to break contact. In theory, doctrine minimizes risk by making behavior predictable to allies and commanders. But predictability cuts both ways. On the Eastern Front, predictability became a signal. When formations behaved as expected, opponents could anticipate the next move before it happened. The French pilots recognized this early, not as a philosophical insight, but as a survival lesson. They stopped trying to win by perfect execution. They started winning by disrupting expectation. One of the first things German pilots noticed was the absence of rigid formation discipline. Where other units tightened formation under threat, these pilots often did the opposite. They allowed spacing to widen. They broke visual symmetry. To an observer trained to read formations, this looked like disorder or loss of control. It was neither. Spacing created ambiguity. Ambiguity delayed decisions. And delay, even brief, was fatal. Another deviation involved altitude. Traditional doctrine emphasized altitude advantage as a prerequisite for engagement. Altitude meant energy. Energy meant options. But insisting on altitude also imposed timing constraints. You waited until conditions were optimal. You climbed, repositioned, and prepared. The French pilots often refused to wait. They initiated engagements earlier, sometimes at apparent disadvantage. This forced German pilots into reactive positions before their formations were fully prepared. The goal was not immediate destruction. It was initiative seizure. Once initiative was taken, the engagement changed shape. German doctrine relied on hierarchy. Leaders initiated, wingmen supported. Decisions flowed downward. This worked exceptionally well against opponents who respected the same structure. But when facing pilots who did not mirror those expectations, hierarchy became friction. French pilots did not wait for commands in the air. They did not rely on constant radio coordination. Radios were unreliable anyway. Instead, they relied on intent recognition. Intent was communicated through motion. A sudden climb was not an individual maneuver. It was a signal. A sharp break was not evasion. It was a handoff. A committed dive was not recklessness. It was a trigger. This required an extraordinary level of mutual trust. But it also required something rarer, the acceptance that no plan would survive contact. Where doctrine emphasizes pre-planned responses, this system emphasized continuous adaptation. German pilots described this as irrational. Reports mention attacks that ignored logic, formations that collapsed without warning, and opponents who appeared simultaneously in multiple positions. From inside the cockpit, this felt like being attacked by individuals who were not behaving as a unit. In reality, they were facing a unit that had abandoned rigid coordination in favor of dynamic pairing. Instead of fixed leader-wingman relationships, pairings shifted fluidly. Pilots responded to proximity, orientation, and opportunity rather than rank. The system rewarded awareness over obedience. A pilot who saw a threat acted immediately, trusting that others would read the situation and adjust. This had a powerful psychological effect. German pilots were trained to anticipate responses. They knew what should happen when they attacked, when they disengaged, when they drew an opponent into a turn. Against these French pilots, the response often violated expectation. Attacks did not resolve cleanly. Disengagement did not restore order. The fight refused to stabilize. This instability created cognitive overload. Pilots had to process more variables faster, under stress, in environments where milliseconds mattered. Decision-making slowed. Errors increased. And this is where the system produced results. Victories did not come from technical superiority. They came from decision disruption. The French pilots did not try to outfly their opponents. They tried to force them into hesitation. They attacked early, changed vectors unexpectedly, and broke off when logic suggested continuation. Each action chipped away at the opponent's confidence in prediction. Over time, this had cumulative effects. German pilots began adjusting behavior preemptively. Some avoided engagement unless conditions were overwhelmingly favorable. Others hesitated longer before committing. Formation integrity suffered as individuals attempted to compensate for uncertainty. These adaptations, intended to reduce risk, actually amplified it. The more German pilots tried to restore order, the more predictable they became. And predictability was precisely what this system exploited. What makes this system difficult to replicate is not its complexity, but its cost. It demands constant exposure to risk. It requires pilots to operate without the comfort of procedure. It cannot be safely tested or gradually implemented. It emerges only under sustained pressure, where survival forces behavior to evolve faster than doctrine can respond. This is why it remained localized. Most air forces could not afford to abandon structure. The risks were too high. The potential for catastrophic loss was too great. Institutional command systems depend on predictability to function at scale. The French pilots operated as an exception within the system, not a model for it. And yet, that exception was enough. By the time German units began advising avoidance or demanding numerical superiority before engagement, the pattern was established. The victories accumulated not because each engagement was flawless, but because the system consistently generated advantage at the margins. Small advantages, repeated hundreds of times, produced 273. This reframes the number entirely. It is not a tally of heroic feats. It is the measurable output of a behavioral system that targeted certainty instead of strength. A system that treated chaos not as a failure state, but as a controlled environment. But this success came at a cost that statistics alone cannot convey. Operating without structure increases cognitive load. Constant adaptation exhausts decision-making capacity. Trust replaces safety nets. When mistakes happen, there is no procedure to fall back on. The pilots paid for this effectiveness in fatigue, stress, and loss. To understand the full weight of this system, we need to examine what it demanded from the men who used it, not in moments of victory, but in the long stretches between them, in the accumulation of missions, in the slow erosion of margin. That cost is the next part of the story. From the outside, the numbers suggest momentum. Victories accumulate, ratios improve. Reports speak of effectiveness and tactical advantage. But inside the unit, time did not feel like progress. It felt like compression. There was no pause long enough for recovery, no safe rhythm. Missions stacked on top of missions, sometimes multiple sorties in a single day. Fatigue was not an occasional condition, it was the baseline. The system that produced success demanded constant presence. There was no room for detachment. Every engagement required full cognitive commitment, immediate decision-making, and absolute trust in others who were equally exhausted. This kind of performance is not sustainable indefinitely. It burns margin. Aircraft reflected this first. Machines returned with damage that should have grounded them. Bullet holes patched, panels replaced, systems improvised. Engines were run longer than intended. Maintenance cycles shortened out of necessity. There was no reserve fleet waiting in the background. What flew today needed to fly tomorrow. But machines can be repaired. People cannot be reset so easily. The pilots slept irregularly, often poorly. Cold never fully receded, even indoors. Meals were functional, not restorative. Psychological stress accumulated without vocabulary. At the time, there was no concept of combat fatigue as it is understood today. Exhaustion was treated as weakness, something to be ignored rather than addressed. And ignored it was. This created a paradox inside the unit. The more effective they became, the more they were relied upon. The more they were relied upon, the less opportunity they had to recover. Success generated demand, and demand eroded capacity. Loss did not arrive as singular catastrophes. They arrived incrementally. A pilot fails to return from a routine patrol. An aircraft explodes before recovery is possible. Another survives a crash but never flies again. Each absence forced adaptation. Roles shifted, pairings changed. Trust had to be rebuilt constantly, often under fire. What makes this cost difficult to capture is that it did not break the system outright. It weakened it slowly. Pilots learned to recognize the signs of deterioration in themselves and others. Slower reactions, narrowed attention, emotional flattening. But recognizing fatigue did not change the operational reality. Missions still needed to be flown. The sky did not pause. There was no replacement pipeline that could keep pace. New pilots arrived underprepared, entering an environment that assumed instant competence. The system absorbed them quickly, or rejected them brutally. There was no middle ground. From the outside, victory continued. From the inside, survival became statistical. Every sortie carried the knowledge that the system worked, but only if everyone remained fully present. One lapse, one misread signal, one delayed reaction could collapse the fragile coordination that replaced Doctrine. This is the hidden cost of controlled chaos. Without rigid structure, resilience depends entirely on human capacity. And human capacity is finite. The French pilots did not collapse because they were reckless. They endured because they accepted that endurance itself was part of the mission. But endurance exacts payment. Some pilots became withdrawn. Others grew sharper, colder, more focused. Humor thinned, conversations shortened. Attention narrowed to the immediate present. Long-term thinking faded. There was only the next sortie. This psychological narrowing is not accidental. It is a survival response. But it also carries consequences. When identity contracts around function, loss becomes harder to process. Pilots did not grieve publicly. There was no time. Names disappeared from rosters. Aircraft flew with different pilots the next day. Absence became normalized. And yet, the system held, not because it was humane, but because it was adaptive. This raises an uncomfortable point. The effectiveness of the system depended not only on tactics, but on the willingness of individuals to accept unsustainable conditions for prolonged periods. This is not a virtue, it is a circumstance. When historians speak of ratios and victories, they rarely ask what kind of human environment produces those outcomes. Numbers flatten experience. They conceal accumulation. By late 1943 and into 1944, the cost became impossible to ignore. Losses mounted. Survivors carried injuries, both visible and internal. Fatigue deepened. The margin for error narrowed further. And yet, operations continued. This is where the myth of heroism often intrudes. It is tempting to frame persistence as courage alone, but persistence here was structural. Withdrawal was not an option presented to individuals. The system had no exit ramp. The pilots understood this implicitly. They were not fighting for recognition or reward. They were fighting to maintain coherence long enough for the system to continue functioning. This reframed sacrifice. It was not about dramatic last stands or singular acts of bravery. It was about the steady acceptance of cumulative risk, about flying again despite knowing that probability was no longer in your favor, about trusting others who were equally compromised. And this trust mattered. Without rigid command enforcement, trust became the only stabilizing force. Pilots relied on each other, not because doctrine demanded it, but because survival required it. This created bonds that were functional rather than sentimental, deep but quiet. From the outside, the unit appeared effective. From the inside, it was constantly balancing on the edge of depletion. This tension is crucial to understanding what came next, because when the war moved toward its conclusion, when victories accumulated and the strategic picture shifted, the system that had delivered success no longer fit comfortably into the post-war world. The very qualities that made it effective in war made it inconvenient in peace. To understand why this story faded from prominence, we need to move beyond the battlefield and examine what happened when the fighting stopped. Because the silence that followed was not accidental, it was structural. Wars do not end when the fighting stops. They end when a story replaces the violence. By 1945, the French pilots who had fought on the Eastern Front returned as veterans of one of the most lethal theaters of the war. Their records were intact. Their victories were documented. Their losses were undeniable. On paper, there was no ambiguity about what they had done. But history is not written on paper alone. The moment the war ended, a new order began to take shape. Alliances shifted. Former partners became ideological adversaries. The Soviet Union, once an indispensable ally, was rapidly redefined as a threat. And stories that had made sense during the war became politically inconvenient afterward. The experience of French pilots fighting alongside Soviet forces did not fit the emerging narrative. Post-war Europe needed clarity. Clear heroes, clear villains, clear lines between East and West. The complexity of shared sacrifice on the Eastern Front disrupted that clarity. It reminded people that victory had been collective, uncomfortable, and ideologically messy. For France, this created a particular tension. The nation was rebuilding its identity after collapse, occupation, and internal division. The story that emerged emphasized resistance, liberation, and redemption. It needed symbols that unified rather than complicated. Narratives that could be celebrated without qualification. French pilots who had fought under Soviet command did not offer that simplicity. They challenged multiple assumptions at once. They suggested that resistance did not always flow through London. They suggested that collaboration with the Soviet Union had been honorable. They suggested that effectiveness did not always align with post-war alliances. In a political environment increasingly defined by Cold War binaries, this was difficult to accommodate. As a result, the story did not disappear through censorship. It faded through omission. There were no public scandals, no official denouncements, just silence, absence from curricula, minimal representation in popular culture, occasional mentions, stripped of context and consequence. This was not unique to France. It reflected a broader process. In the post-war West, historical memory became streamlined. Complex theaters were simplified. Contributions were ranked implicitly by ideological alignment. The air war over Western Europe received extensive attention. The Eastern Front, despite its scale and cost, became distant, abstract, and politically sensitive. Within that framework, a small group of French pilots operating deep inside Soviet airspace occupied an uncomfortable position. They did not reinforce the dominant narrative. They complicated it. Popular history tends to favor stories that align with contemporary values. In the decades following the war, those values emphasized Western cohesion, technological superiority, and moral clarity. Stories that blurred those lines were less likely to be amplified. This helps explain why the achievements of these pilots rarely translated into lasting cultural recognition. There were no major films, no widely distributed dramatizations, no iconic imagery that embedded them into the public imagination. Their story lacked a champion in the industries that shape memory. Hollywood, which played a central role in constructing global perceptions of the war, focused overwhelmingly on Anglo-American experiences. When stories were told about Allied cooperation, they were reframed to preserve familiar hierarchies. Complex realities were simplified or avoided altogether. This was not necessarily malicious. It was structural. Narratives that travel well are those that require the least explanation. A story of French pilots flying with Soviet forces on the Eastern Front demanded context. It required audiences to hold multiple truths simultaneously. It resisted reduction, so it remained marginal. Within France, the situation was further complicated by unresolved guilt and memory. The existence of pilots who had chosen the hardest possible fight, who had refused both defeat and comfort, implicitly highlighted choices others had not made. That contrast was uncomfortable. It was easier to celebrate resistance movements that symbolized collective redemption than to confront examples that underscored individual divergence. And so the story became awkward, not false, just inconvenient. Over time, inconvenience becomes invisibility. Archives remained, veterans aged, reunions grew smaller. Recognition persisted within limited circles, but failed to penetrate broader consciousness. The number 273 survived in records, but not in memory. This process reveals something fundamental about how history functions. What is remembered is not only what happened, but what serves the present. What is forgotten is not necessarily unimportant, but misaligned. The French pilots who destroyed 273 German aircraft did not fit the post-war story France wanted to tell about itself, nor the story the West wanted to tell about the war. Their experience sat at the intersection of alliance, ideology, and effectiveness in ways that resisted simplification. And stories that resist simplification rarely endure without active preservation. This does not diminish what they accomplished. It contextualizes its disappearance. The silence was not an accident. It was the result of selection, which brings us to the final question. If this story does not fit the narratives that followed the war, why does it matter now? Why revisit it decades later, after the political conditions that shaped its erasure have changed? The answer has less to do with nostalgia than with understanding. Because this story is not just about French pilots or German aircraft. It is about how effectiveness can emerge outside systems, how institutions respond to anomalies, and how memory filters complexity over time. And those questions are not confined to history. They are ongoing. At first glance, this story appears sealed in its time. Propeller-driven fighters, frozen airfields, a war that ended generations ago. It would be easy to treat it as an isolated historical curiosity, impressive but irrelevant. That would be a mistake. Because the real significance of these French pilots is not found in the aircraft they flew or the enemies they faced. It lies in what their experience reveals about systems, assumptions, and how power responds to behavior it cannot easily classify. The pilots who destroyed 273 German aircraft were not anomalies because they were exceptionally gifted individuals. They were anomalies because they operated outside the dominant frameworks of their time. They did not belong neatly to British doctrine, American doctrine, or German doctrine. They existed in the gaps between systems, and those gaps are where unexpected effectiveness often emerges. Modern institutions, military or otherwise, are built on predictability. Predictability enables coordination at scale. It allows organizations to plan, measure, and control outcomes. This is necessary for stability, but it also creates blind spots. When everyone trains against the same assumptions, those assumptions become invisible. The French pilots exploited this invisibility, not intentionally, not as a grand strategy, but as a consequence of operating without the luxury of alignment. They were not protected by institutional momentum. They could not afford to preserve procedure for its own sake. Survival forced them to adapt faster than doctrine could. That dynamic is not unique to war. In every complex system, from organizations to technologies to cultures, rules emerge to manage risk. Over time, those rules harden into identity. They define what is considered professional, responsible, or acceptable. And once that happens, deviation becomes threatening, even when it works. This is why the story of these pilots was difficult to absorb afterward. They did not fail. They succeeded too visibly, in a way that challenged the logic of established systems. Their effectiveness did not validate existing doctrines. It exposed their limitations. That exposure was uncomfortable. In the post-war period, the world did not want stories that questioned the reliability of structure. It wanted stories that reinforced it. Stability required narratives where success flowed from order, hierarchy, and planning. Stories where chaos, even controlled chaos, was an aberration rather than a tool. So this one was sidelined. But time has a way of changing what societies are willing to examine. Today, we live in systems that are once again struggling with unpredictability. Complexity has increased faster than control mechanisms can keep up. Rigid models break under conditions they were not designed for. Institutions face challenges that do not respond to established playbooks. In that context, the experience of these pilots becomes relevant again, not because their tactics can be copied, but because their approach to uncertainty can be understood. They did not eliminate chaos. They worked inside it. They did not seek perfect information. They acted with incomplete data. They did not wait for permission. They responded to opportunity. Most importantly, they understood that predictability is not always a strength. This does not mean that structure is obsolete or that disorder should be embraced blindly. The pilots themselves paid a heavy price for operating this way. Their success was inseparable from exhaustion, loss, and personal cost. There is nothing romantic about that, but their story forces a question that remains relevant. What happens when systems become so confident in their own logic that they can no longer recognize alternatives? The German pilots they faced were not incompetent. They were among the most experienced aviators of the war. Their doctrine worked extraordinarily well, until it didn't. Not because it was wrong, but because it assumed reciprocity. The French pilots broke that assumption. They remind us that effectiveness does not always scale neatly, that innovation often appears as deviation, and that systems tend to resist evidence that challenges their foundations. This resistance is not malicious, it is protective. Organizations protect their coherence. Cultures protect their narratives. Memory protects what makes sense. Which is why stories like this resurface only when conditions change. The number 273 is not important because it is large. It is important because it forces a reevaluation of what we think success looks like. It suggests that under extreme pressure, adaptability can outweigh optimization, and trust can replace procedure. That idea is uncomfortable. It always has been. It was uncomfortable for German commanders who could not explain why engagements kept going wrong. It was uncomfortable for post-war governments trying to present clean narratives. And it remains uncomfortable today, in a world that prefers stability over ambiguity. But discomfort is often a signal. It tells us that something worth understanding is being ignored. The story of these French pilots does not ask to be celebrated uncritically. It asks to be examined honestly. Not as a legend, but as evidence. Evidence of how people behave when stripped of certainty. Evidence of what emerges when survival demands adaptation faster than institutions can respond. That is why this story matters now. Not because it flatters national pride, not because it offers easy lessons, but because it reveals how fragile our assumptions can be when reality refuses to cooperate. And there is one final aspect of this story that completes the picture. One that brings us back to where we began. Because when the last of these pilots died, there were no grand ceremonies, no widespread recognition, just a quiet ending to a story that had never fully entered public consciousness. What remains is not a myth. It is a record, and records have a way of resurfacing when the moment is right. When everything is stripped away, history is left with numbers. Victories confirmed, missions flown, aircraft lost, men killed. For the French pilots who fought on the Eastern Front, the number that survives most clearly is 273. 273 German aircraft destroyed. A figure repeated in archives, cited in studies, verified across opposing records. But numbers are deceptive. They suggest completeness. They imply closure. They create the illusion that something has been fully understood. In reality, numbers only tell us what can be counted. They do not tell us what was tolerated, what was endured, or what was quietly accepted as the price of effectiveness. The final accounting of these pilots is not found in their kill ratios. It is found in what their story reveals about how history chooses what to remember. They were not erased because their achievements were small. They were not ignored because their contribution was unclear. They faded because their story disrupted comfortable explanations. Their existence challenged several assumptions at once. That resistance followed predictable paths. That effectiveness aligned neatly with dominant powers. That success validated the systems that produced it. They showed that a small group, operating outside formal structures, could outperform larger, more organized forces by exploiting certainty itself. That was an inconvenient lesson. After the war, the world moved on quickly. New conflicts emerged. New alliances hardened. The past was reorganized to serve the present. In that process, complexity was trimmed away. The French pilots who destroyed 273 German aircraft did not disappear from records. They disappeared from relevance. Their story lived quietly in specialist histories, in reunions attended by fewer people each year, in aircraft preserved without context. It survived, but it did not circulate. And then time did what time always does. It removed the immediate political need for silence. As archives opened and generations changed, the raw material of history became accessible again. not to glorify, but to examine, not to simplify, but to confront. When viewed without the pressure of post-war narratives, the story becomes clearer. These pilots were not exceptional because they were fearless. Fear was constant. They were not exceptional because they were indestructible. Many did not survive. They were exceptional because they adapted faster than the systems around them. They accepted uncertainty as a permanent condition. They trusted human judgment over procedure when procedure failed. They treated predictability as a vulnerability. This is not a model that can be easily replicated. It is not even one that should be romanticized. It worked under specific conditions, at immense cost, and for a limited time. But it happened. And because it happened, it forces us to rethink how success is explained. The Germans they fought were not inferior. The doctrines they used were not flawed in isolation. What failed was the assumption that effectiveness must always look the same. The French pilots broke that assumption. That is why their story remained uncomfortable. And that is why it matters that it is told accurately now, without myth-making or omission, not to claim superiority, not to assign moral rankings, but to acknowledge reality. History is not a clean sequence of triumphs. It is a record of adaptation under pressure, of people making decisions with incomplete information, and of systems being tested beyond their design limits. The number 273 is not the point. The point is that it happened at all. That under conditions where survival was measured in missions, not years, a small group of pilots rewrote expectations and paid the price for doing so. They were not sorcerers. They were not legends. They were men operating inside a gap that history was not ready to explain. And when the war ended, that gap closed. What remains now is a choice: to repeat simplified stories that feel comfortable, or to confront the ones that complicate what we think we know. The French pilots who destroyed 273 German aircraft do not demand admiration. They demand attention, because they remind us that history is not just shaped by power, or numbers, or victory. It is shaped by what survives explanation. And sometimes, the most important stories are the ones that were never meant to fit. If this story changed the way you see World War II, support the channel by subscribing. Every view keeps stories like this from disappearing again. Tell us in the comments if you had ever heard of these pilots before today.